This happened to me in the early 80s when I was about 14 or 15 years old. I lived on a quiet street in the suburbs of my city, in a small place you wouldn't call the countryside, but close, in a Spanish island of the Atlantic Ocean. It was known locally back then that little girls started disappearing more often, but it wasn't yet a topic of conversation between the towns and neighborhoods. Most of my friends lived in the city, so I would often take the bus to go meet them. That day at around 5 or 6 p.m., I decided to start walking to the bus stop, since I was going to meet my friend that evening. The bus stop wasn't actually that far from my house, maybe a half a mile in distance. It was located on a quiet street with few cars or people around and lined with old street lamps that flickered even in the daylight. I had taken this route so many times that I didn't really think anything of it. When I got there, the street was dead and had no cars or nobody to be seen around, so I just stood up for a few minutes waiting for my bus. A while later, a white van slowly approached my direction and started slowing down right next to the bus stop. I didn't think much of it, like maybe they were just parking or looking for something. But then two men got out and started walking towards me. One of them looked normal enough, but the other man caught my attention because his face was kind of deformed, with one hollow eye socket where his left eye should have been. His other eye locked onto mine, and the intensity of his gaze made me freeze on the spot. Before I could even process what was happening, they had a hold of me. One grabbed my arm with a grip so tight it felt like my bones were gonna snap, and the other wrapped his arm around my waist, dragging me towards the van. Neither of them said a word, although to be honest, their silence was worse than anything they could have said. I started screaming and kicking as hard as I could, but there was literally nobody I could see around. I remember I even started yelling, "Fire, fire," since my mom had told me it was like a code for people who were getting abducted. It really was a horrible feeling seeing myself getting pulled closer to the van, knowing I couldn't do anything to avoid it. They shoved me into the van, and as I landed on the floor, I saw a third man with a bandana covering his face and a Doberman that were staring at me with a disgusting, creepy face that still haunts me to this day. It was in that moment that I started to think that no one would help me or even hear me at all. I started struggling and fighting back, and I kind of managed to get them off me for a second, but they kept grabbing me and pulling me back in. I remember this distinctive metallic smell inside the van, like rust or maybe blood. I felt like probably the luckiest person on earth when, out of nowhere, my older brother showed up. He didn't live with us at the time, so coincidentally he was probably visiting us that day. I don't really remember why he was there. He started yelling and throwing punches at the men. In the struggle, they let go of me and I managed to pull myself free and back away. The men seemed to be caught off guard. After a few seconds of fighting, they ran back to their van, slammed the doors, and sped off. Right after that moment we ran home and I started crying in desperation. The walk home was hard, since my legs were shaking non-stop. I felt overwhelmed and couldn't really process what just happened to me. People who have experienced something similar to this know how shocked and paranoid you start feeling after this. We reported it to the police later that night, but they didn't do much. Things like this weren't taken very seriously back then. Last summer, I was almost kidnapped. I usually walk around my neighborhood, sometimes biking, but mostly on foot. As I was walking, listening to music, a car pulled up beside me. Since I was near someone's house, I didn't think much of it and assumed it was their house they were pulling up to. I was wrong. Just to give you an idea of the difference in size between me and this man, I stand at 5 feet 115 pounds, while he looked to be around 6 feet 3 inches tall, 180 pounds. As he came out his car, he started a conversation with me. He asked, "Where are you headed?" I responded with a short, "Just walking around." He then said, "It's pretty late." want me to give you a ride home?" I declined, saying, "No, thanks. I don't live in this area." After I made this statement, he looked at me and asked why I was walking alone. I simply ignored him and quickened my pace, causing him to speed up as well. Eventually, I came across a house with its garage open. Without thinking, I ran in, seeing an older man sitting in there. I told him that someone was following me and to please help me. He got up and started yelling at the man following me, telling him to fuck off and saying that he had a gun. The man retreated back to his car and sped off. I thanked the garage man and he told me to stay safe. That night, I ran as fast as I could back to my house. Every year in the early 2000s, my parents would send me to Poland for the summer. I would spend the first week at my best friend's/old neighbor's house, then her dad would bring us both to my grandparents' farm where we would spend the rest of the summer. My cousins and their parents would also be staying there a lot throughout the weeks. Most days it was my grandparents, great-grandmother, 5 cousins, aunt and uncle and myself and my friend who lived in the house. Since there was so many people staying in there most nights and limited space, my 2 cousins, friend, and I decided it would be best if we camped out in the garden right outside the back room. The room had a patio right off its glass door which gave us easy access into the house. The summer was going like any other. The 4 of us were having a blast hanging out late night around the town. We had full freedom as nobody would know what time we would come back to our tent. The village my grandparents lived in was very secluded and houses were spread apart with fields of corn and other crops growing between. The place was extremely dark and many nights we would lay in the street and look at stars. One night, there were less people in the house and my friend and 1 cousin were in the back room off the garden watching a movie as my other cousin and I were hanging out in our tent. At one point we heard footsteps circling our tent. We were so scared and decided to stay quiet and still. Finally we heard the footsteps walk away and the door handle of the glass door leading into the back room being rattled. My friend and cousin must not have heard it, but me and my cousin decided to peek out. All we saw was a dark figure with a lit cigarette walking away from the door and leaving the property. We were so freaked out we decided to all spend the night in the house. Come to find out, there was a man who escaped a mental hospital a few towns over. He was in there for raping and killing his sister. To this day we still have no idea who the person that came by that night was, or the intentions that they had. We're so glad that nothing more happened that night. I was nearing the end of my training at Goodwill to learn custodial skills when this happened. The work was tough, and it was exhausting being the only student left and having to clean before the store opens by myself. By the time I got home, I would pass out and nap for a number of hours. I think the stress of it all was getting to me, because something really scary happened during that time. I got up super early in the morning as I had been doing for the past weeks for the training program, and the mornings were getting lighter and lighter out, which was nice. As I was heading out the side door, I stepped out onto the small platform where there were stairs to go down and looked up towards my parked car. I froze in place and widened my eyes in confusion and absolute fear. My body tingled with that feeling of fight or flight. In my car, I saw what looked to be a Saint Bernard dog snarling at me from the passenger's seat in the front. I don't even know if I was breathing while I stared at my car with the dog inside of it, and it still snarling in my direction. My hand reached for the doorknob of the house and I rushed back inside. I began to breathe heavily and wondered what I was going to do. My dad was sleeping soundly on the couch. I considered waking him up, but I realized that this was silly. There was no reason that there should be a Saint Bernard in my car. We don't even have that kind of dog breed, or one that size for that matter. I bit my lower lip and gathered up my courage and went back outside. wondering if the dog was still in my car. I stepped outside and looked, it was still there. Looking at me and, yes, still snarling. Right then I lost all my courage once more and felt my heart sink into my gut. How was I going to deal with this thing? The only thing I could do was walk to it. With car keys in hand, I gripped them tightly, giving just a small amount of pressure pain to help divert my fear of the dog to that instead. Then I slowly and carefully walked to my car, my eyes never leaving the Saint Bernard in my car. As I got closer, the dog's appearance slowly dissipated until it looked like just the empty inside of my vehicle, all light gray interior. It was the weirdest thing I had ever seen. Even now I cannot really explain it, but it's possible that the stress and exhaustion had caused me to see things. Just thought it odd that of all things, I would see a Saint Bernard, and it certainly scared the crap out of me.